My biggest prediction is we will discover a lot more species of snakes. We've been describing about 30 new species of snakes, completely new to science, every year since the year 2000. I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon.
Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Andrew Durso, an expert on snakes and reptiles. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Micah. It's great to be here.
To start, tell us about the reptiles you study.
Sure. So I mostly study snakes. I especially like to work on non-venomous snakes because there are so many different kinds and we know so little about them. Your average person tends to gravitate towards venomous snakes, and I have worked on those too, but there's about 80% of all the snakes in the world are non-venomous, and a lot of those are super understudied. So, for two examples, I've done a lot of work on aquatic snakes in the southeastern United States. So, species like crayfish snakes, mud snakes, black swamp snakes, these small aquatic species that can be very abundant in certain systems, but we know very little about. And I've also done quite a bit of work on snake identification internationally, particularly to support snake bite victims and clinicians who are treating them and trying to make the correct selection for antivenom. So, those have been kind of my two big projects that have run throughout my whole career.
5 snakes.
Yeah, so we have a couple different approaches. The most accurate way is to have an expert look at a picture of the snake and identify it. That has some drawbacks. There are not that many experts. Sometimes experts need to sleep or do other things. So we have two other approaches. One is crowdsourcing. So you may have seen this on some kind of citizen science platform like iNaturalist, where anybody can send a photo and then you get IDs from other people in the community. People also use social media for this. There are some extraordinarily active snake identification groups on platforms like Facebook, where you can usually get a pretty accurate crowdsourced ID in a pretty short amount of time. The other aspect that we also use increasingly is artificial intelligence, so computer vision algorithms that can identify anything from an image given sufficient training data. The challenge there is that it's hard to get a good amount of training and testing data for those algorithms for rare species of snakes that occur in remote parts of the world. So, like right now, I'm trying to get more images of snakes from South Sudan because it's a high priority area. There's a ton of snake bite there. There's been a civil war going on since 2011. You've got a lot of people who are living in refugee camps. They don't have shoes. They get bitten by snakes when they're walking in the bush or picking up firewood. And experts like me get questions from doctors working in South Sudan, what kind of snake is this? And it's very hard to say because there's not a lot of good references or resources for that area. So that's a project I'm actively working on right now, trying to beef up our knowledge of what's in South Sudan and how do we identify it.
How many snake attacks on humans there are in a year?
So there are no snake attacks on humans. Snakes don't attack humans. Snakes defend themselves. They sometimes bite people when they do that. They want to be as far away from people as possible. The numbers I think you're looking for, so globally, there's something like 500,000 snake bites every year. It's really hard to get an exact number on something like this, of course, because many of them don't get reported. But a lot of those results, mostly people don't die from snake bite, right? The vast majority of people survive. Best estimate is something like 80,000 to maybe 120,000 deaths from snake bite every year, and the vast majority of that is taking place in developing countries like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, places like that. In the US and Europe and Australia, it almost never happens. I can tell you easily off the top of my head that the average number of snake bite deaths in the United States each year is 5, so very low, right?
What's the most common way people get killed by snakes?
Some snakes have venom that they use to kill their prey, right? Venom is strong saliva, and it has two functions. It immobilizes the prey, so it's easier for snakes to eat it, right? Snakes don't have any arms and legs, so they have to eat their prey whole. They eat prey that's really large compared to themselves. Imagine that you were trying to swallow a watermelon without cutting it up, right? If you could somehow immobilize that watermelon so that at least it couldn't fight back, that's what snakes are doing with their venom. Now, secondarily, some snakes also use their venom for defense. Not all. A lot of snakes only use their venom to hurt their prey. They really can't use it in defense because their fangs are too small and they're too far back in their mouth. But there's two groups of snakes that have fangs closer to the front of their mouth. These are vipers and another group that we call elapids. So elapids include snakes like cobras, mambas, sea snakes. In the Americas, we also have coral snakes, which are elapids. And so these snakes are the ones that are capable of delivering a dangerous bite to a person. If a snake is cornered, if it feels threatened, if it's stepped on, if a person accidentally picks it up or places their hand on it when they're doing some gardening, gathering firewood, whatever. These are the most common ways that snake bites take place, right? The vast majority of snake bites are accidents. In some places, like the US, where you have a significant fraction of people who maybe don't have the greatest common sense when it comes to interacting with wildlife, then you have some percentage of bites, maybe 20-30%, that are caused by what we call intentional interactions. The person is like picking up the snake and trying to show off to their friends, or maybe they're trying to kill the snake. But in the developing world, the vast majority of these incidents are accidents, right? The person didn't see the snake, didn't want to interact with it. The snake didn't want to interact with the person either. And a very high percentage of the time, the snakes just, their first line of defense is they don't move. They're typically very well camouflaged, and then the person passes by unnoticed. Then after that, they would try to escape, and only as a last resort do they actually try to use their venom in self-defense. So it's rare compared to the total number of human-snake interactions, but of course there's a lot of humans out there. So 100,000 people dying a year out of a total of 8 billion is a very small percentage.
Is the mom the snake that kills the most people every year?
The snake that kills the most people every year is probably Russell's viper, and that's because it is a large, dangerous snake that is found throughout India, and India is the most populous country. So there's more people that live in the range of that snake than any other.
What about all the cobras people play with in India?
So you're thinking of like maybe snake charmers and things like that. Yeah, cobras are a potentially significant source of mortality in both Asia and Africa. People that handle cobras professionally as snake charmers typically have one or more precautions in place to prevent themselves from ever being bitten by their cobras. They may do pretty inhumane things like pull out that cobra's teeth or sew its mouth shut. And even if they don't do that, they probably have enough common sense to realize that there are safe ways to handle these animals without exposing yourself to too much risk. If snakes really truly did attack people, you wouldn't have any snake charming shows because all the snake charmers would have gotten attacked and killed right away. And that doesn't happen. These cobras are timid animals that much prefer to just sit quietly in their basket. What I can say is that in the United States, we don't typically have snake charming shows, but we do have certain religious groups that handle venomous snakes as a way of testing their faith. So there are people that go to a church where they handle live venomous snakes every Sunday. And then we also have rattlesnake roundups, which are these festival type events where people collect rattlesnakes and bring them all to a central location, and they have a state fair and kill all the rattlesnakes and then use their skins and their meat and everything else. You can buy some deep fried rattlesnake on a stick or some souvenirs or something like that. Definitely possible to debate the moral aspects of both of those, but I can certainly say that there is data to show that people that participate in either of those two activities have a higher than average snakebite risk, and there have been a couple of high profile deaths from snakebite in both of those communities.
So what's the most interesting thing you've learned about snakes?
To me, one of the things that's most amazing about snakes is that almost every person has strong feelings about them. Snakes are like polarizing. People pay attention to them, and I think there's maybe something evolutionary there. Our ancestors ate snakes and were eaten by snakes for many tens of millions of years. So we are probably pretty well prepared to pay attention to them. So recently we had a rattlesnake in our lab in Florida. We are really lucky because our campus has a big population of eastern diamondback rattlesnakes on campus. And so we do some science on them, and we also relocate them for people when somebody calls up. One time I was at home actually, and I got a call from the secretary of our department who said, there's a rattlesnake on the soccer field, and the other people who would typically go and get it aren't in today. Could you come in and relocate it for the soccer team? So I drove in, and a bunch of people are standing around looking at this bush on the edge of the field. The snake had gone under the bush. So I had with me a snake hook, which is a long piece of metal with kind of an L-shaped hook at the end. I had a pair of tongs, which are just what they sound like. It's like one of those little like T-Rex dinosaur head grabber things that have a handle on one end. And then I also had with me a box that had a lid that you could latch and lock. So I put the box on the ground, opened the lid, stepped back, reached out, grabbed the snake with the hook and tongs, put it in the box. It did nothing because it was probably not, it wasn't feeling that defensive. It was just hoping that it hadn't been noticed. And so if you do that quickly and calmly, 9 times out of 10, they don't even react. Flip the box shut with the hook, latch it, put the lock on, bring it back to the lab.
What have you learned from tracking snakes?
Yeah, tracking snakes can be really exciting because you get to learn secrets about them that you normally wouldn't. Most of the time, they sit in one spot and do nothing, which doesn't sound that exciting, but occasionally they do really exciting things, like they might mate with each other. Rattlesnakes have male combat, which means that two males will try to like get on top of and push the other one's body down to the ground, and then whichever one of them wins that contest earns the right to court a particular female who might be in the area. So it's very exciting when we get to see that. Of course, occasionally they eat. They don't eat very often. Eastern diamondbacks eat probably an average of 3 times a year. They shed their skin. Sometimes they make interesting long distance movements.
What are some of snakes' predators?
Other snakes, birds of prey like hawks, owls, eagles, medium-sized mammals, so things in the U.S. you would think of things like foxes, skunks, raccoons. Possums are a major predator, especially of venomous snakes. Virginia possums are actually immune to the venom of copperheads and other pit vipers in the southeastern U.S., so they eat a good number of venomous snakes.
Which snake populations are endangered because of people?
Quite a few, unfortunately. In the eastern U.S., there's a number of species that have declined by 80-90%. Eastern diamondback rattlesnake that I mentioned before. Right before this podcast interview, I was on Zoom with a colleague who studies Brazos water snakes in central Texas. This species could go extinct in the next 100 years because we've put so many dams on the Brazos and destroyed so much of the good riffle habitat that they like to forage in there. So we're making plans to visit that field site because I'd like to see that species before it goes extinct. Eastern indigo snake is another really good example of a critically endangered snake species. This is the largest snake in the United States. They can reach lengths of over 8 feet. Non-venomous, jet black, glossy snake that mostly eats other snakes, including eastern diamondbacks and other venomous snakes. And they just have really big home ranges. So anywhere that has roads tends to be bad indigo snake habitat. They get run over when they try to cross roads, and they try to do that frequently because their home ranges can be several square miles.
What snakes are endangered outside of North America?
I think you could put together a long list. The most endangered ones are going to be the ones that have really small geographic ranges to begin with. So a species that's found on one mountaintop in the Andes, or maybe around one spring in a desert in central Mexico or something like that. We don't have such detailed data on the conservation status of snakes in places like Africa and Asia. When you invited me, you asked me to talk about this Perils of Flawed Science article where some scientists were trying to make the argument that wildlife trade endangers species of snakes, and others were saying maybe they had some flaws in their methods that may not be as dangerous for them as we think. There's an interesting example, actually. You've probably heard of Burmese pythons. These are one of the largest snakes in the world. They're native to Southeast Asia. And the reason that they're so high profile for people in the US is that they've been introduced to South Florida. So there's hundreds of thousands of them in the Everglades. And they're one of the few snake species that are an invasive species in one part of the world, and at least by some definitions could be considered an endangered or threatened species in another part of the world in their native range, right? They have lost quite a bit of habitat there. They are collected and exported for their skins because you can make some really nice boots and handbags and things out of python skin. It looks nice, it's very durable, and they're big, so you can make a lot of stuff out of one snake. The guy that wrote this paper, Dan Natsus. I don't even actually know if I'm saying his last name correctly. Anyway, he's an expert on wildlife trade and snakes. Some of the analyses that they did looking at farming and harvesting of reticulated and Burmese pythons in Southeast Asia seem to suggest that it might actually be a sustainable harvest. There isn't as much evidence that the maximum size or the number of these snakes is declining over decades of harvest. Now, that isn't to say that couldn't change, right? There's always an upper limit to these things. But there are a number of reptile species that people also like to make stuff out of alligator and crocodile skin, and for decades there was unrestricted harvest. Go out and shoot as many alligators and crocs as you want, and you can make a lot of money doing that because there's this big demand for their skins. And then over decades, people realized maybe we should start farming these animals instead, and then we have a more reliable supply for their skins, and that sort of disincentivizes people to go out and harvest them in the wild. And that actually has worked really well. Almost all of the crocodile skin products that are made today come from farmed animals. Wild populations, in many cases, are doing better than ever because we removed that hunting pressure. American alligator is a good example, but that's happened in India, in Africa, in South America, in the Caribbean. All that hunting pressure is off. And there has been some pretty impressive recovery of crocodilians because of the ability to exploit the trade in such a way that allows farming to take the place of wild harvesting.
Where are the snake farms, and have you been to one?
I've never been to one. There are a number of snake farms in Indonesia and Malaysia that focus on reticulated pythons. Those are probably the best studied. The group that wrote the article that you sent, Rick Shine and Dan, they have visited these snake farms and collected incredible amounts of data, tens of thousands of snakes, learned a lot about their natural history. Some of those places are a combination of snake farm and processing center for wild animals that are harvested and brought in. And I think that's where some of the fuzziness in this reporting comes in. Some people are using these data sets to say that there's a lot of violations of the CITES Treaty. So that's the organization that polices international trade in endangered species. Having worked with those data a little bit, the paper that I published that drew you to me, I can say that it is complicated to deal with some of those statistical issues.
What do you know about illegal snake trade?
I tend to think more of the illegal trade in live snakes for the pet trade than in snake skins for the fashion industry. I suspect, based on my understanding of the literature, that there's less and less illegal trade of skins, but the illegal trade in all sorts of live animals for pets is unfortunately alive and well. So there's a lot of smuggling. People have an incentive to smuggle rare species that are not common in captivity because they know they can sell them for a lot of money. There have been some really high profile busts of actors in this sphere who do this all the time and have gone to jail and in some cases been given fines. Some of those fines are very small compared to the amount of money that you can make by doing these illegal activities. And I think that's because the legal system doesn't really tend to take wildlife crime as seriously as it does other types of crime, which in my opinion is a mistake because often the same people and the same sources that are involved in smuggling rare snakes or lizards are also involved in smuggling drugs or guns or trafficking humans. It's all the same techniques that are used to do those things.
Okay, so let's now talk about snakes as pets.
Sure, plenty of people have pet snakes. I used to have pet snakes. I don't anymore because I do so much other stuff with snakes that I find I don't really have the desire or time for that anymore. All the snakes that I ever had as pets were ones that I either rescued or obtained for free in some other way. If you want a pet snake and you're not really picky about what kind of snake, it's very easy to find unwanted pet snakes. Many people invest in corn snakes or ball pythons or other commonly kept species, and then after a while realize that they don't have the time or resources to take care of them. So in that sense, it's not that different from pet cats or pet dogs or anything else. So personally, I don't feel that good about spending money on buying live pet snakes, whether that would be from like a big chain pet store or from a private breeder, is very difficult to tell as a consumer whether a snake has been illegally captured in the wild or legally bred in captivity. I think your guiding principle should be try and get a captive bred animal if you can, because in that sense you can be 100% sure that it hasn't had a negative impact on a wild population.
So, do you think stores should sell snakes?
Gosh, it's a loaded question. On the one hand, it's probably not the most harmful thing in the world. On the other hand, morally, it does strike me as slightly exploitative that any animal could be bought and sold. These are living things, and I think reducing them to commodities can be a bit inherently disrespectful. I think there is a certain type of person who will acquire a snake or a different type of pet because they maybe have a passing interest in it, or kids want it, seems cool, and they don't really understand the responsibility they're taking on, and then that probably causes some suffering to the animal and potentially also has other negative consequences, especially if it puts additional pressure on wild populations where those snakes, of course, play a role in the ecosystem.
Do you think the snakes who are kept as pets are happy? Because you
Oh,
did
gosh.
say before that the snakes want to stay away from the humans.
Yeah, good question. I don't know that snakes can be happy or sad, but I do think that certain snake species are much more tolerant of people than others. So those commonly kept species that I mentioned before, like corn snakes and ball pythons, I think there's a lot of capacity within the gene pool of those species to adapt to situations in captivity and at least not be bothered by it. Maybe what we don't see are the thousands and thousands of corn snakes that didn't do very well in captivity. Now we're at a point in history where all the corn snakes that people keep as pets are descended from ones that already did pretty well in captivity. I think it's unethical to keep any animal in conditions where it's suffering. So, yeah, I think there's ways to do it wrong. There's definitely ways to do it right enough that it probably doesn't cause any real suffering or harm. And that probably describes the majority of snake keepers, I would guess.
Which countries in the world have the most snakes as pets?
United States, hands down. We love to buy stuff. That's almost a defining characteristic of the United States. European countries, people do keep snakes as pets. It's not quite as mainstream.
Tell us some interesting things you've learned about snake biology.
Sure. So, in one study, we were interested in understanding more about what hognose snakes eat. I had this hypothesis that maybe the ones that ate more toxic prey, including toads, would be more likely to play dead when they were frightened by a predator. And so to do that, I needed to measure what they were eating, which is really hard to do because snakes don't eat very often. Probably 75+% of the time when you catch a snake, it has nothing in its stomach. So I used two other techniques to try and like sneakily figure out what they were eating. One is that I collected their poop. Snake poop doesn't tend to have a lot of chunks or anything left over from their prey, but we were able to extract DNA from their poop and match that up with DNA sequences of potential prey and get some insight into what they were eating that way. The other thing we did is we used a technique called stable isotope analysis, which is basically like matching up chemical signatures in their bodies with chemical signatures from different things that they might be eating. And the surprising thing about that study was that it turned out that pretty much none of the hognose snakes in that population were eating any toads or amphibians at all. They were mostly eating turtle eggs as well as lizards and lizard eggs. So I wasn't able to test my original hypothesis, but I learned a lot about what hognose snakes were eating, how to figure that out, and I thought that was probably one of my most fun projects that I ever did.
What do you see for the future of snakes over the next 30 years?
My biggest prediction is we will discover a lot more species of snakes. We've been describing about 30 new species of snakes, completely new to science, every year since the year 2000. I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon. We recently broke 4,000 species. I think by the end of the century, we could be on our way to 5,000 as we begin to understand more about the diversity of snakes that are out there, which is really incredible because that means there might actually be more species of snakes on Earth than there are species of mammals.
What are your biggest worries for snakes over the next 30 years?
I'm sure they'll continue to lose habitat because there's more humans than there have ever been, and we're developing natural places at the fastest rate that we ever have. So that's my primary worry, is that all of their habitats will get turned into housing developments, Walmart parking lots, to a lesser extent, agricultural fields. So I think the biggest thing we can do about that at an individual level, at least as Americans living in the eastern US, is landscape our yards in ways that are friendly for wildlife. That's good for birds, it's good for butterflies. Those are the animals that people tend to like to talk about and like to encourage in their yard. Most people don't really want to invite snakes into their yard, but I do. I feel pretty comfortable with them, so it's maybe a little bit different for me. But that's probably our biggest thing that we can do to address that habitat loss.
Thanks for talking today, Andrew.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians. Bye.